the theory segment this week, and we titled it "Deciphering Signal versus Noise," and it's kind of just a discussion on understanding how to parse out all of the information that we get in fantasy football. And we've talked about this in different respects throughout the season, talking about very early, I think our first or second podcast of the year, we touched on like what are the most relevant stats to follow, and just understanding how we can properly interpret sample sizes. And I think it's an important thing to talk about at this point of the year because we're a little past the halfway point where we have this with pretty big sample of games that we could draw from, but now we kind of get into like what is the proper way to be just we have so much information. We've had coach turnover, we've had player turnover, roster turnover, and it's like how do we figure out what the relevant data is, or what the things that we should be looking to are, and we call it like signal versus noise a lot. So let's talk about just from a pure DFS perspective, the things that we use as our biggest indicators are pricing and ownership. So how we use that to decipher what we should be looking at in a given week on a slate.
Sure. And remember, guys, there isn't one answer to how do you decipher signal from noise. If it was that easy to filter it all out, we would all be billionaires in DFS. But ultimately, we're all looking, as in all the DFS players, we're all looking at the same season-long stats. And trends don't look like trends in the beginning. They look like anomalies. So how do we identify these anomalies as they occur during the season? And how do we see them before they become trends so we can ride those trends to victory? That's ultimately what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So pricing and ownership are our guide to that. And so they're still based, they're a lot better than they used to be, I will say this, but they're still based significantly on single game sample sizes. And single game scores are swayed a lot by touchdowns. And we know that touchdown variance is huge from week to week. We know that it's hard to predict. So fading one game scoring samples is still our biggest edge in DFS. And when ownership coalesces around players who scored a lot, pricing will move as well. One thing I have noticed is that if no one plays a player, even if they are starting to trend in the upward direction, salary will stay down for these sites. But ultimately, people, and I mean just the general DFS player community, go to players who have scored a lot recently. And one thing we can look for is players whose opportunity has been in the same range as those players who scored a lot and play those players. That's the whole point behind the breakout receiver model. So if you take away that first macro point, pricing and ownership still based significantly on one game sample sizes. And if we can look at correct sample sizes, we can almost always gain an edge on the field.
Yeah, the pricing algorithms have gotten a lot sharper in getting away from that a little bit. We still do see some wild fluctuations, especially early in the season, based on performance. But that one game sample size is especially important to note when we're talking about things like GPPs and ownership, and just understanding what the public is undervaluing and overvaluing. A lot of times they're really overvaluing, like you said, just those raw fantasy points, the highlight plays, the big plays, and we see usually the bigger fluctuations in ownership than we do in pricing. I mean, you'll see a player easily goes for the community's been really good about not like going overboard on super chalky players. Like people understand that you want to be contrarian, but you still see a fluctuation from a player whose role hasn't changed go from a 25% play to a 5% play. And a lot of that is based on things like matchup. And I think matchup is probably, especially in tournaments, like we're splitting hairs in cash games because we're looking for our highest floor. In tournaments, it's almost easier to like make these decision points because, well, we might have a similar projection, maybe a similar matchup or a tougher matchup. We get huge gaps in ownership, and we saw it just last week with the biggest slate break of the year in Jonathan Taylor. And it was simply because he was playing against the Bills as an underdog, but he was still as much workload as any running back or in the league. The touches are there, and that's always like it's pretty consistent where throughout DFS, no matter how good we get, there's only so many people in the community that are really hardcore DFS that are understanding these things. And the public is still going to be the the vast majority of players that aren't full-time players, they're the ones that are really going to be controlling this ownership, right? You're just not going to get 30% of the field to ever play Jonathan Taylor in that spot. It's just never going to happen. So that's where you really get the value on these one game samples. And then going back to your point about understanding salary trends and how they work, it's not just like looking at it on a weekly level. I think one thing that is important to do is tracking prices throughout the season, salaries throughout the season, to look for these inefficiencies, players that just aren't properly valued. Sure, you can do a salary relative to point projection. We're always going to have that dollar per point projection, but how are these players supposed to be valued in terms of what they provide as a player? And we're seeing it like in action this week. Christian McCaffrey, fourth game back from injury, but and he's been doing good but not great, and he's still priced well below his salary ceiling. Like we've seen him all the way up at 10K on FanDuel. He's still $900 below his highest point of salary this year on DraftKings. And where do we think he's appropriately priced? Like next to other running backs, or way higher than other running backs? When it's appropriate, it's probably way higher than any other running backs. A player like CMC, it should always be really hard to decide if he's worth $1,000 more than the next guy, not if he's worth $100 less than Jonathan Taylor. Same thing with like Devontae Adams on Yahoo this week. He's priced at his lowest salary of the season after having like basically his biggest game of the year. He's like down $8 from his highest point. That's just a major red flag inefficiency that if people are just looking at dollar per point might not stand out to them. And on the other side, a player like Cam Newton, you mentioned the one game sample. He starts one game, obviously does very well, but his price kind of skyrockets on FanDuel. And now he's priced up kind of close to some of these other guys and isn't just like a smash. He's a value still, but his salary does go up quite a bit.
Yeah, I see it all the time where players blow up and the opportunity hasn't changed at all. That's why I think that when you compare salary to value, you actually can get the ceiling projection built in, the matchup built in. So all of those factors that we're trying to mix in to just the simple projection, the value metric on 4for4.com does better. Really, if you're looking for one number that encapsulates everything and that you want to compare directly to salary, I honestly think there isn't a better metric than the 4for4 value.
Yeah, and we talk about like not double counting, right? And going back to JT, like even though the tough matchup was in there, like John Paulson isn't ignoring the matchup. Like he's giving him a point projection based on the matchup, and then he's still a great value. So like when you're fading him when he is 5% or 2%, whatever it was, in a game where his projection was still fine, that's double counting. People are like his matchups already accounted for in almost every projection model you're looking at. But then when he's 5% versus 30% running backs, that's a huge double counting error. Let's talk a little bit about away from DFS and just kind of a general fantasy point, how we're understanding, and you talked about the one game sample sizes, how we should be understanding like what we should be looking at in terms of sample sizes for positions and for fantasy points.
Well, let me caveat what I'm about to tell people by saying there are obviously statistically fancier ways of doing this than I'm about to suggest.
Yeah.
But if we begin to use rolling averages for players over a set course of games, we are going to get a lot closer to their expected output or their expected fantasy points, if you look at that, than you are by just looking at one game sample sizes. And we've actually done all the data-based dirty work in our DFS playbook series. You can actually see what the optimal sample size is to look at for each position. And there is a little bit of noise in that. I bet if we reran the model year after year, we would see slightly different numbers. So there isn't an exact science to this. But if we get generally correct, directionally correct, and look at, say, a 5-game sample for quarterbacks, that's going to be a lot better than the people who are going to be looking at the whole season trends for quarterbacks. You are going to have an edge there. So ultimately, I think sometimes we want to look at the one game sample to understand changes. But ultimately, when we see trends over a course of rolling averages in both usage, opportunity, and in production, we are going to be finding things faster than the public who is still using season averages.
Yeah, and it's probably a tough thing to, especially if you're relatively new to DFS or fantasy football research in general. If you're trying to like dive into this a little bit deeper, you probably hear sample size, and you want to think, well, how can a shorter sample not be more noisy? And it's just because we have these things like we have changes in personnel, we have on both sides of the ball, and variance in what a matchup might look like, which is why on something like our schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed model at 4 for 4, we do use, like you said, a rolling 10-week average, so that we're not overweighting this game from week one where teams were insanely different. Maybe they gave up a big game to a position way back then, but that gets less and less relevant as we get later into the season. So we use a rolling average for something like that. And you mentioned positionally, we have found these optimal numbers for if we're just looking at fantasy points per game. Obviously, that's the number we're chasing, but a one game sample can be heavily weighted by just a single touchdown in any position. What we found is, in general, quarterback is usually the sweet spot is around that 5-game sample. Running back is around that 3-game sample. Wide receiver, the bigger sample we get, the better, because they are just a very high variance, low volume position. And then tight end, like a 3+ game sample is when the fantasy points per game number starts to get the most predictive. But again, it's just a function of looking for, not using that as a baseline, using those numbers as a baseline, but understanding that we do have big changes in personnel and groupings and coaches. So like the 49ers as example, who we talked about at the top of this podcast, when we have Jimmy G now with Kittle, Ayuk, and Debo all playing well, that's probably the relevant data we want to look at. Like, Jimmy G isn't going to lead the league in passing efficiency. That's not the point. That's not what we're trying to extract from that data. What we're trying to understand is that Jimmy G can be very efficient with this trio. Now we should, like, if I'm looking at 49ers offensive data, I'm going to be looking at from week 9 on. Like, I don't really care about anything that's happened before, because that's just not the same team at all. And we'll get a little better understanding now this week with Elijah Mitchell there. But just from an efficiency standpoint, we want to be tracking those things, and that kind of, those numbers kind of naturally fit into the data that we've laid out in the DFS MVP. Because sure, we won't know after 1 week, but 3 or 4 weeks, that data becomes very, very strong.
And we do want to mention, too, that we're using these rolling averages as baselines, right? Because DFS is about a game of range of outcomes. So if we have a correct baseline, then we can adjust and we say, okay, this is the appropriate ceiling projection. This is the appropriate floor projection based on this new change in personnel. And obviously the DFS pass from 4 for 4 is going to do a lot of that hard work for you. But this is just a little view behind the curtain, how we figure all of that out for you guys. It's using those relevant sample sizes to create strong baselines.
Yeah, and we talk about it's really hard to find an edge in fantasy football from a research perspective. I think there are edges in research here, because it's very easy to click on almost any data provider, any like widely available stat provider is going to have season long numbers, and anybody that is doing any type of content can say, this team's allowed the most points to quarterbacks this year. That's easy to look up. To parse down this information, to find these samples, it's not that people don't know how to do them, but it takes a lot more work. And if you are getting content or getting analysis that isn't focusing on things like this, you are going to be missing the mark on some things. Now, obviously, there are a ton of people that do this correctly, but there's also a lot of information out there that isn't taking these things into account. And then on the other side, there's content that just goes way too far with it, right? There's so many of these fancy stats that sound good and that you can use to prove your point, but are they actually translating to fantasy production? That's a whole nother thing. So by, again, going back to this thing of not double counting and understand what we've laid out in something like the DFS playbook, that is how we can start to separate like these signal from the noise. Now, when we go beyond just the data, and I think there is always context to data, and we need to understand how to like talk about what's probably going to happen, what data we can take as something that is indicative of a trend, that can come down to some more like obscure or like opaque things such as coach interviews and whatnot. So how are we looking into signal versus noise when we're trying to figure out like what the change in an offensive coordinator or a play caller? That's a big one when we're seeing with the Giants this week. How do
Yeah.
we account for things like that?
So, what you just talked about is so important, and it leads directly into the idea of coach speak, because we can use fancy math, we can use fancy statistics to get us part of the way, but elite domain knowledge, and I mean about the NFL and the whole game of the NFL media and the game on the field, plus statistically sound practices can still help create an edge in DFS.
Yeah.
And so, what we need to be able to do as we develop that domain knowledge about the NFL and the little nuanced things that happened over and over again in the course of a season and over the course of many seasons, are these little actions that teams have, or big actions sometimes, that speak louder than their words, because coaches are asked silly questions after every single practice
Yeah.
and every single game, and they are forced to come up with an answer, and most of those answers mean nothing. They are the definition of noise.
Right.
But there are actions throughout a week that we can see as signal for sure, particularly in injury situations, when they call up a running back from the practice squad the day before. Even though we don't know the inactive status of that running back one, that is often a signal that the team is preparing for a change in running back personnel. That's a signal. Always, draft picks and trades are a signal of a team displaying what its needs are. They cannot lie about what they believe their needs are unless they then they wouldn't trade for that player.
Right.
So that is always signal. And this kind of goes hand in hand with what we're talking about with relevant sample sizes, but increased snap share and target share that hasn't necessarily resulted in increased production share is a huge signal. And that is the basis behind our breakout receiver model. We are looking for players who have already gotten the opportunity necessary for production, but just haven't seen that production yet. But when you see that increase in opportunity, and then in the post-game presser, the coach talks about the need to continue to do that, that's when I really perk up, because then we have action, and then a coach confirming that action as not a mistake, not an accident. Those were the reads on those plays. So this is a very, very silly example, but one that comes to mind all the time is in Tariq Cohen's rookie year. I believe he had 8 or 9 targets his very first game of the season, and he was this undrafted guy. And they came out at the end of the game and they said, he's something special, isn't he? They were clearly holding him back, and they didn't want him to be known as a part of the game plan. Yeah. Tariq Cohen is obviously a thing then for that version of the Chicago Bears. So when we hear things like that after an 8-target game, that's when it's really all systems go, and you can try to make a decision before that typical 3 to 5 game sample size that we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's where the preparation in terms of understanding the this is where you could tie in the data with the coach speak, understanding all of the things that we referenced previously, the volume or the type of usage that actually does matter, the type of things that does translate to fantasy scoring. If they are getting increased usage in that way, then that is something very important. Like, it's very easy for a coach to say, yeah, we're going to use this guy more and he's a valuable part of our team. But does that mean he is going to be a valuable fantasy asset? If that's a vague statement to say we're going to use this guy more, he's very important to our team. I mean, for someone like a tight end, that could be his snap share might go from 25% to 75%. But if 95% of those are for blocking plays, like, what does that matter to us? And I do think it is one that it probably is like the biggest wedge between people that do what we do and people that listen to what we do, because probably one of the most common comments that I'll get, especially if I'm like on Twitter or something, when I'm tweeting out something that I think is like a relevant data point coming up, I get so many responses that are like, oh, well, the coach said X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, that is fine. But like I have this like hard 4 week data that says like this is what they're doing, and a lot of times they're like they are like these sound bites that are easy to hang on to, and coaches are doing this, or whoever, players, they're giving these interviews like every day every week all season, probably at times where they don't want to be doing it. There's like, they're humans, right? There's a good amount of time where they're just saying words to get the interview over with, and it's probably not a lot, but there are those times where they're just like they're talking, right? Just say answering the question just for the sake of answering the question. One thing that I do think probably does hold some weight, and one thing that I will pay attention to when it comes to something like getting signal from noise versus coach speak, it's very often that a coach will either be encouraging, or at the very least be vague about a player. It's just not a situation where you don't see too many professional coaches talk down about a professional athlete. It just isn't good. Even if they know they can talk to the player that way, it's just not even worth the media storm, right? When we hear a coach say something negative about a player, I'm way more likely to hang on to those words, because to say something bad about a player means that they're going to have a very strong feeling about that, and they're willing to take on like the heat of that. And we saw it like very early in the year with Brandon Ayuk, right? It took a very long time for him to get back in the mix. Shanahan wasn't shy about saying that he wasn't coming on like they expected. You just don't hear a lot of harsh negative comments about players. When we do, I think that's often going to be a lot more signal than just like some words they said in passing.
That's a great point. Ronald Jones as well.
Hmm.
I will say Bruce Arians is one where
Yeah, Bruce
you have
Arians
to
will go.
take him
He'll
with a
go
grain
hard.
of
He'll go
salt.
hard. Bruce will go hard.
Yeah.
Let's just kind of wrap it up by kind of talking about a, a little bit of what we just covered, but just talking about how things can alter based on not just coach speak and not the data, but how they can alter week to week, from contest, or from just like not a coaching change, but like a new role for a player.
Yeah, I think all of these rules that we come up with here are really heuristics. They're
Right.
guides
Yeah.
for trying to discern things. There are real no hard and fast rules. And remember, DFS is about leaning into uncertainty and being able to play lineups that others aren't they're too scared to play. They aren't
Yeah.
able to play because it doesn't feel right for whatever reason. So I will admit that I will lean into things that I think are noise
Right.
based on contests to see if they might be signal, and I'm wrong,
Yeah.
because there could be an unknown upside from the benefit of being wrong and it actually being signal. I think one of the situations we talked about, the Jacksonville Jaguars offense, no one really saw Jamal Agnew stepping up for DJ Chark in the absence of DJ Chark, but he clearly had a role defined for him early on. And if you were able to ride that trend and see that before it was a thing, really, those are the kinds of situations where after one game, I might look
Mhm.
at that stat and say, I think that's noise. I can't
Yeah.
trust that. But in a GPP, it's low owned. There's no salary change and there's no ownership change. I'll lean into it. I'll lean
Yeah.
into it and I'll treat it as if it's signal. In a cash game, I won't be ready to treat it as signal.
Right.
It's still noise. So it's still a tournament play, but that's the kind of variable thinking I can do with signal versus noise thought. I'm not going to be right all the time, and I want to have asymmetric upside when I'm wrong and it is actually signal.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, is like the variability and understanding how we should be using these samples. I think it's a really good point to end on. And it could be something as simple. You talked about using heuristics to make these decisions and not be like trying to get lost in what it means and what it doesn't. And I think a really good heuristic to lean on when it comes to something like that is, if there is a one game sample that we're trying to decipher if it's signal or noise, if the public is leaning heavily on that one game sample, then we could avoid it. If the public is ignoring that one game sample, then we can lean on it. A really good example happened just on the Thanksgiving slate. We saw Josh Reynolds have a huge snap share, lots of air yards, only 3 targets. Nobody was playing him. We have a huge sample of him not being very fantasy relevant this year. Since nobody's paying attention to it, it's worth throwing a dart. He gets there early on a big play, and it works out. If everybody was talking that up and we think he's going to be 20% after only seeing 3 targets, probably not worth it. And if he gets there, you're willing to fade it.
Yep, 100%. ownership matters in DFS. Who knew?
Yeah, exactly. All right, cool.